Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. In a land carved by wind and baked by a relentless sun, where the law is a forgotten prayer and justice is measured in the weight of gold and the speed of a bullet, the strongest spirits are often found in the quietest souls. Pull up a chair and listen close, for this is the story of Clara Harlow. It's a tale of how a woman with nothing but a broken heart and a piece of land nourished by her tears taught the most feared men in the territory that a widow's grief is the most dangerous weapon of all. This is the story of the ghost of Harlow's Ridge. The land was a language, and Clara Harlow was one of the few who knew how to read it. She could read the promise of rain in the scent of the dust, the passage of time in the deepening lines on the face of the canyon, and the quiet contentment of a good life in the steady, rhythmic breathing of her husband, Jacob, as he slept beside her. Their farm was not a grand place. It was a stubborn patch of green carved into the unforgiving ochre of the Dust Devil Valley, a testament to two pairs of hands, a shared dream, and a deep well that was the envy of all. Clara was a woman who seemed to have been spun from the quieter elements of the landscape. She had a gentle disposition, a smile that was as rare and precious as a wildflower, and hands that were skilled in the arts of healing and nurturing, whether it was a sick calf, a struggling crop, or a neighbor's feverish child. People in the nearby town of Solitude saw her as Jacob's wife, a kind, soft-spoken, and ultimately a remarkable woman. They did not see the core of patient steel that Jacob had seen and cherished. It was Jacob who had taught her the other language of the land, the language of the rifle. He was a veteran of the war, a man who had seen enough noise and violence to last a lifetime, and had come west seeking silence. He had brought his Sharps rifle with him, not as a weapon of war, but as a tool of survival. "It's not about the killing, Clara," he told her, his large, gentle hands guiding hers as she held the heavy, long-barreled rifle. "It's about the stillness, about becoming a part of the landscape. You watch, you breathe, you wait. The world slows down. Everything becomes clear. The shot is the last part. It's just a punctuation." Under his patient tutelage, she had learned. She learned to control her breath until it was a whisper, to read the wind, to calculate the drop of a bullet over a long distance. She had a natural talent for it, a calmness and a focus that surprised even Jacob. She had used the skill only to hunt, to put meat on their table, her heart always giving a small pang of regret for the life taken. She was a creator, not a destroyer. Their quiet life existed on the edge of a brutal reality. The valley and the town of Solitude were unofficially owned by a man named Silas Blackwood. He was a land baron with a veneer of legitimacy and a heart of pure granite. He owned the biggest ranch, the only saloon, and the soul of the town's beleaguered sheriff. Blackwood was consolidating his power, buying up or forcing out the smaller homesteaders, his eyes fixed on the one resource more precious than gold in this arid land, water. And the Harlows had the deepest, most reliable well in the valley. Blackwood's argument was delivered by his enforcers, a pack of hard-bitten men led by a swaggering brute named Gage. Gage was a man who enjoyed his work, who saw fear as a currency and pain as a perk of the job. He had visited the Harlow farm twice, making Blackwood's generous offer to buy them out. Jacob had refused, politely but firmly, both times. "This land is not for sale," Jacob had said, his hand resting on the fence post, his stance solid and immovable as an old oak. "Our roots are in this ground." The third visit came on a Tuesday, as the sun was beginning to bleed across the western sky, painting the clouds in shades of fire and blood. Clara was in the kitchen, the scent of baking bread filling the small, warm house. She heard the horses, the familiar, arrogant sound of the gang's approach. Her heart tightened. She looked out the window and saw 5 of them, with Gage at their head. Jacob was coming in from the fields, his own rifle resting in the crook of his arm, as was his habit. Clara went to the door, a dish towel in her hands. The conversation started low, but the tone was different this time. There was no pretense of a negotiation. "Blackwood's done a skin, Harlow." Gage's voice was a gravelly sneer. "He's taken this land. The well is his. You can walk away with your wife, or you can be carried away in a box. You're on my property, Gage." Jacob's voice was steady, but Clara could hear the iron in it. "I'll ask you to leave. We ain't going nowhere." Another of the men laughed. What happened next was a blur of brutal, sickening speed. One of the men spurred his horse, fainting to Jacob's side. As Jacob turned, his attention momentarily diverted, Gage drew his pistol. He didn't shoot to wound. He shot to kill. The first bullet took Jacob in the chest, the sound a flat, ugly crack in the peaceful evening. Jacob staggered, a look of profound shock on his face. His own rifle unfired, pointed at the ground. A cry, thin and raw, was torn from Clara's throat. She ran onto the porch just as Gage fired again. And again. They didn't just kill him, they executed him, riddling his body with bullets in a pointless, savage display of dominance. He fell into the dust he had worked so hard to cultivate, the last sunset he would ever see reflected in his unseeing eyes. The men laughed. Gage spat on the ground near Jacob's body. Should have taken the offer, he said, not to Jacob, but to the frozen, silent figure of Clara on the porch. His eyes, cold and reptilian, met hers. He saw nothing there to concern him. Just a woman, struck dumb by shock, another piece of property to be cleared from the land. You've got 1 week to be gone, Gage snarled at her. After that, everything here, including you, belongs to Mr. Blackwood. They wheeled their horses and rode away, their laughter swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. Clara stood on the porch, the world having dissolved into a silent, gray haze. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She walked down the steps, her feet moving as if through deep water, and knelt in the dust beside her husband. She gathered his broken body into her arms, laid her head on the still warm ruin of his chest, and stayed there as the last of the light faded from the sky and the cold, star-filled darkness descended. In the utter silence of her shattered heart, something new and terrible began to take root. The funeral was a short, grim affair. The people of Solitude came, their faces a mixture of genuine pity and palpable fear. They offered Clara their condolences in hushed, nervous whispers, their eyes darting towards the saloon where Blackwood's men drank openly, their laughter a constant, mocking counterpoint to the somber gathering. Sheriff Calloway, a man whose spine had long ago been eroded by compromise and fear, said a few empty words about justice, but his gaze never rose from the dusty toes of his boots. They saw Clara as a tragic figure, a broken thing. They offered to help her pack, to arrange for the sale of her livestock. The assumption was unspoken but unanimous: she would run. A lone woman couldn't possibly stand against Silas Blackwood. It was a foregone conclusion. Clara accepted their condolences with a quiet, unnerving stillness. She refused their offers of help with a simple, "Thank you, but I'll manage." They mistook her shock for weakness, her silence for resignation. After they had all gone, leaving her alone with the freshly turned earth of the grave and the hollow echo of her own breathing, she did not go back inside the empty house. Instead, she walked to the small barn. There, in a long wooden box lined with fleece, lay Jacob Sharp's rifle. She ran her hand along the smooth, cool steel of the barrel, the worn wood of the stock. This was the tool that he had taught her to use, the focus of their shared moments of stillness. In her mind, she could hear his voice, patient and calm. Breathe, squeeze, become a part of the landscape. It was a language of peace, of survival. Now, it would have to become a language of war. The decision was not a flash of anger. It was a slow, cold crystallization of grief into purpose. The law was dead in this valley. Justice was a word for fools. The men who had murdered her husband were not just going to take her land, they were going to erase him, to plow over his memory as if he had never existed. They would not be allowed to. This farm, this piece of earth mixed with his sweat and now his blood, was the last thing of him she had left. She would not surrender it. For the rest of the week, she became a ghost in her own life. During the day, she did her chores with a mechanical, detached precision. She milked the cow, fed the chickens, tended the garden. But her eyes were always watching, her mind always working. She watched the patrols of Blackwood's men, noting their routes, their schedules. She saw how they rode, bunched together on the main trails, confident and careless. At night, she took the Sharps to the high ridge that overlooked her farm, the very place where Jacob had taught her to shoot. She didn't fire it. Ammunition was too precious. Instead, she practiced finding her stillness. She would lie for hours in the darkness, the heavy rifle resting in her hands, its weight a familiar comfort. She would watch the stars wheel across the sky and let the rage and the grief flow through her, not consuming her, but sharpening her focus until it was a fine, hard point. She began her preparations. She took the old buckboard wagon and dismantled it, using the heavy planks to reinforce the inside of her window frames, leaving only narrow slits to see and fire through. She dug a shallow trench along the side of the house that faced the main road, a rudimentary but effective firing position. She filled sacks with dirt and piled them in the loft of the barn, creating a sniper's nest with a commanding view of the entire valley approach. Her movements were quiet, deliberate, and went completely unnoticed. To any observer, the Harlow farm was simply a place in mourning, waiting to be abandoned. The one-week deadline came and went. No one came to evict her. It was a psychological game, she realized. They were letting her fear and isolation do their work for them, expecting her to break and flee. Her staying was an act of defiance they hadn't yet bothered to notice. Her target was not Silas Blackwood. He was a snake's head, safe in his nest. Her targets were the hands that had done his bidding. The men who had laughed as her husband lay dying in the dust. And she would start with the one whose laughter had been the loudest, a lanky, red-haired man named Finn who had been the one to feign and draw Jacob's attention. She had watched him for days. Every third morning, he rode the south fence line of Blackwood's ranch, a lonely, predictable route that took him through a narrow, rocky pass a mile from her farm. It was the perfect location. High ground, clear line of sight, and a dozen escape routes into the broken terrain. On the third morning, 2 weeks to the day after Jacob's murder, Clara was in position before the sun rose. She lay on a high ledge, concealed by a cluster of sagebrush. The Sharp's rifle rested on a small pile of rocks, steady as a church pillar. She was dressed in Jacob's old, faded brown shirt and trousers, her hair tied back, her face smeared with a little mud to dull the pale shine of her skin. She had become a part of the landscape. She waited for hours. The sun rose, baking the rocks around her. A lizard skittered past. A hawk circled high overhead. She felt no impatience. She simply existed, a point of focus, silent will. Then she saw him. A lone rider, moving at a lazy pace, a bottle tilted to his lips. It was Finn. He rode directly into the pass, into the killing zone she had chosen. Clara tracked him through the rifle's scope. The world shrank to the small, clear circle of the lens. She saw the sweat on his face, the smug, careless expression in his eyes. She saw the man who had helped murder her husband. She put the crosshairs on the center of his chest. She let out half a breath and held it, just as Jacob had taught her. The world went silent. There was no rage, no hatred. There was only the stillness, the calculation, and the cold, grim necessity of the task. She squeezed the trigger. The Sharp's rifle was a cannon. Its roar was a physical blow, a sound of profound and terrible authority that echoed through the pass. Miles away in solitude, people heard the faint, distant boom and thought it was thunder. Through the scope, she saw the bullet strike. Finn was thrown from his saddle as if by a giant, invisible hand. He landed in a heap and did not move. It was over in a heartbeat. Clara worked the rifle's action, ejecting the spent cartridge, its metallic scent sharp and clean in the air. She didn't watch the body. The man was gone. The punctuation had been delivered. She slid back from the ledge, retrieved her shell casing, leaving no trace was paramount, and melted back into the rocky landscape. The ghost of Harlow's Ridge had claimed her first soul. The discovery of Finn's body sent a ripple of unease through Blackwood's ranks. He was found by the next patrol, a single, massive hole in his chest, his horse grazing placidly nearby. There were no tracks, no witnesses. Sheriff Calloway was summoned, and he dutifully pronounced it an unfortunate hunting accident, though no one believed him. A man like Finn didn't get shot by accident, not with a buffalo gun from half a mile away. Gage was the most unsettled. He examined the scene, his brutish mind struggling to comprehend the clean, professional nature of the kill. He had enemies, of course, but this felt different. It was too clean, too quiet. It felt impersonal. He doubled the patrols and warned his men to ride with more caution, a command that was met with grumbling and bravado. Lightning didn't strike twice. Clara, from her farm, heard the news like everyone else, from the loose-tongued gossip of a traveling tinker. She felt no triumph, and satisfaction. She felt only a grim, hollow sense of purpose. One was down. For remained of the men who had been there that day. Her next target was a man named Scully, a thick-necked bully who served as Blackwood's primary enforcer in solitude itself. His job was to collect protection money from the town's few merchants and to remind everyone who was in charge. Scully was a creature of habit. Every afternoon, he would swagger into the general store to harass the owner, then sit on the porch outside, his chair tilted back against the wall, drinking a stolen beer and watching the dusty street with an air of bored menace. This skill would be more dangerous. It was in public, in the heart of the town. But Clara saw an opportunity in the very predictability of his routine. She spent 2 days studying the problem. From the ridge behind her farm, she could see the town, but the general store was obscured by other buildings. A direct shot was impossible. She needed a different vantage point. Her mind settled on the abandoned belfry of the town's dilapidated church. It stood at the end of the main street, opposite the general store, offering a perfect, elevated line of sight. It was a risky position. It was in the town itself, and her escape would be complicated. But the belfry was a place of shadows and forgotten things, a place no one ever looked. The night before, she slipped into town, a ghost in the moonless dark. The church door creaked in protest as she entered the musty, silent space. She climbed the rickety ladder to the belfry, the air thick with the smell of dry rot and sleeping birds. From the narrow, arched window, the view was perfect. The porch of the general store was laid out before her like a stage. She returned to her farm and spent the rest of the night preparing. She couldn't bring the sharps. It was too long and cumbersome to move secretly through the town. Instead, she took the rifle Jacob had owned before the sharps, a more common but still accurate Winchester. It was less powerful, but more portable. The next afternoon, she made her way back, not through the town, but through the broken, hilly country behind it, circling around to approach the church from the rear. She left her horse tethered in a ravine and crept the last 100 yards on foot. She slipped back into the church, her heart a slow, steady drum. She climbed to her perch and waited. The minutes stretched into an hour. The town went about its business, the citizens carefully averting their eyes from the places where Blackwood's men gathered. Then, right on schedule, Scully emerged from the general store. He tipped his chair back, opened his beer, and propped his dusty boots on the railing. He was a perfect, stationary target. Clara rested the Winchester on the stone windowsill. Breathe. Stillness. The world slows down. Through the sights, she saw not a man, but a problem to be solved. A debt to be paid. She aimed for the heart. The crack of the Winchester was sharp, but not as deafening as the sharps. It was a sound that was quickly swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. On the porch below, Scully's chair slammed forward. The beer bottle slipped from his fingers and shattered on the wooden planks. He looked down at his chest, a dark spot rapidly blossoming on his shirt, his expression one of pure, uncomprehending shock. He slid from his chair and lay still. Chaos erupted in the street. People screamed and ran for cover. Blackwood's men, caught completely off guard, started firing wildly, their bullets thudding into the walls of the surrounding buildings. They had no idea where the shot had come from. In the belfry, Clara did not wait to watch the aftermath. She worked the rifle's action, catching the ejected shell casing before it could clatter on the stone floor. She backed away from the window, scrambled down the ladder, and slipped out the back of the church. Within minutes, she was back at her horse, melting away into the hills. The ghost had struck again, this time in the very heart of their power. The death of Scully changed everything. This was no accident. This was an assassination. A hidden enemy was targeting Blackwood's men, one by one, with terrifying precision. Fear, for the first time, began to creep into the ranks of the enforcers. They started riding in larger groups, avoiding predictable routines, their bravado replaced by a nervous, watchful paranoia. Silas Blackwood was enraged. He was losing men, and more importantly, he was losing control. The aura of invincibility he had carefully cultivated was beginning to crack. He sent for Gage, who was now half mad with frustration and a growing sense of dread. "Find him," Blackwood roared, his voice echoing in his large, opulent ranch house office. "I don't care who it is, a rival, a regulator, an old enemy. Find this phantom and bring me his head." The hunt began in earnest. Gage and his men tore the valley apart. They rousted prospectors, bullied ranchers, and terrorized the people of Solitude, looking for any clue, any whisper of who this invisible sniper might be. They were hunting for a ghost, a hardened gunslinger, a man with a grudge. And in all their fury and all their searching, not a single one of them ever cast a suspicious glance towards the quiet, grieving widow on the Harlow farm. She was invisible to them, shielded by their own arrogance and prejudice. While they hunted for a ghost, the real phantom watched them from her high ridge, cleaning her rifle, and planning her next move. The shadows were lengthening, and they were all cast by her. The fear that had once been the sole property of the people of Solitude now had a new owner, Silas Blackwood's gang. The ghost of the valley, as the Whispers now called the unseen sniper, was a more potent threat than any rival gang. An enemy you could see, you could fight. But an enemy who dealt death from a distance, who left no tracks, who seemed to be able to strike anywhere, any Timothy was a different kind of terror. It gnawed at the nerves, frayed tempers, and bred a deep, corrosive paranoia. Clara, in her self-imposed isolation, was dimly aware of the legends being spun around her actions. She heard snippets from the tinker, who now visited her farm with a new, almost fearful respect. He spoke of a vengeful spirit, of a government agent, of a famed lawman operating in secret. Clara simply nodded, her face giving away nothing. She was none of those things. She was a woman with a ledger, and there were still 3 names that needed to be crossed off. Her next 2 targets were a pair of brothers, the Cale twins, who were rarely seen apart. They were brutish and imaginative men who acted as Blackwood's muscle for the dirtier jobs from scudding, barn burning, and the occasional beating. They were always together, which made them a difficult target. A shot at one would immediately alert the other. Clara knew she would have only one chance to deal with both. She watched them for a week. Their new, paranoid routines made them unpredictable. But she found a flaw in their caution. Every few days, they rode a supply wagon from Blackwood's main ranch to an outlying cattle camp. The route took them along a high, windswept mesa. For a stretch of about 200 yards, the trail ran alongside a sheer drop into a deep, rocky arroyo. There was no cover for them, but more importantly, on the other side of the arroyo, half a mile away, was a series of rock formation shootouts that looked like silent, watching giants. It was a sniper's paradise. A shot from that distance, across that chasm, was all but impossible. They would never expect it. It was the kind of shot that demanded the power and accuracy of the Sharp's rifle. It was the kind of shot Jacob had called a conversation with the wind. She prepared for 2 days. She practiced with the rifle, not by firing, but by aiming. She lay for hours on her ridge, picking out distant targets, a specific rock, a lone cactus, and holding the sights steady, calculating the wind, murmuring the corrections to herself. Just as he had taught her. She was refamiliarizing herself with the soul of the weapon. On the morning of the supply run, she was in position long before dawn. The hoodoos provided perfect cover. She had found a narrow crevice between 2 towering rock pillars, a natural gun port that concealed her completely. She lay wrapped in a dusty blanket against the pre-dawn chill and waited. The sun rose, and the mesa across the arroyo was bathed in a clear, golden light. The air was still, a rare gift in this windy land. It was a perfect morning for a difficult shot. Around mid-morning, she saw the wagon, a slow-moving speck in the distance. As it drew closer, she could make out the 2 figures of the Cale brothers on the driver's bench. They were laughing, sharing a bottle, their caution forgotten in the emptiness of the landscape. They entered the dangerous stretch of trail, the wagon wheels creaking, the drop to the arroyo just feet away. Clara took a deep, slow breath. The world shrank to the circle of her scope. The brothers were close together, a single, overlapping target. This was her one chance. She couldn't afford to wound one. It had to be a perfect shot that would incapacitate the first and give her the precious few seconds needed to reload and fire again. She placed the crosshairs not on the driver, but on his brother. She squeezed the trigger. The roar of the Sharps was like the crack of doom, but the sound would take a few seconds to cross the wide arroyo. The bullet arrived first. The brother holding the bottle simply ceased to exist as a coherent shape. The massive slug struck him in the torso, and he was thrown backwards out of the wagon, a broken doll disappearing over the cliff edge. The driver, the other Cale brother, stared in slack-jawed horror at the empty space beside him. He had no idea what had happened. He looked around wildly, his mind unable to process the instantaneous, violent disappearance of his twin. That was the moment Clara needed. With a practiced, fluid motion, she broke the rifle's action, slid the hot, bent cartridge out, and chambered a new one. Her hands were not shaking. Her mind was a block of ice. She found the driver in her scope again. He was just starting to reach for the rifle prop next to him, his face a mask of dawning terror. Her second shot was just as clean. It took him in the shoulder, spinning him off the bench and under the wagon's heavy wheels. The horses, spooked by the sudden lurch and the smell of blood, bolted. The wagon veered wildly, slid off the trail, and plunged into the road with a splintering crash of wood and the terrified screaming of horses. Clara watched for a moment, her face impassive. She had not just killed two men. She had erased them and their wagon, leaving nothing on the trail but a few dark stains in the dust. She ejected the second cartridge, gathered her things, and vanished back into the labyrinth of stone. When the Cale brothers and their supply wagon failed to arrive at the cattle camp, Gage himself led the search party. What they found horrified them. The wreckage of the wagon at the bottom of the arroyo looked like a terrible accident. But then they found the first brother's body, and the clean, massive hole in it told a different story. And they found the drag marks where the second brother, not killed instantly, had tried to crawl away from the wreckage before dying. There were no tracks. The shots had come from across the arroyo, an impossible distance. Gage stood on the edge of the cliff, the wind whipping at his duster, and for the first time in his life, he felt a sliver of genuine, superstitious fear. This was not a man. Men couldn't shoot like this. This was something else. A demon. A ghost. The effect on the rest of the gang was catastrophic. 2 more dead. That was for men in as many weeks. Their numbers were being systematically, invisibly whittled down. Blackwood's promises of wealth and power meant nothing if they were all going to end up in a shallow grave with a hole in them the size of a fist. 2 men deserted that night, stealing horses and riding east. The iron grip of the Blackwood gang was rusting from the inside out. Silas Blackwood, locked in his office, was a man besieged. His empire of fear was crumbling, not from a rival army, but from a whisper, a ghost who was crossing names off a ledger he couldn't see. He was losing men, money, and his reputation. There was only one man left from the group that had murdered Jacob Harlow. The most important one, Gage. And Blackwood knew, with a chilling certainty, that the ghost would be coming for him next. With the Cale brothers gone, only one name remained on Clara's ledger of vengeance, Gage. He was the alpha wolf, the one who had pulled the trigger, the one whose laughter had haunted her waking moments. But he was also the most dangerous. The previous killings had made him wary, a cornered animal who now saw a threat in every shadow. He no longer rode alone. He surrounded himself with Blackwood's remaining, terrified men, and rarely strayed from the relative safety of the main ranch. Clara knew that getting a clean shot at him would be nearly impossible. He was a difficult target, and he was actively hunting her. The hunter had to become the hunted, but to do that, she needed to draw him out, to separate him from his pack. She needed the right bait. Her gaze fell upon her own farm. This land, this well, was the source of the entire conflict. It was the one thing Blackwood and Gage still wanted, the prize for which they had murdered her husband. She had defended it from a distance, with stealth and shadow. Now, she would have to use it as a weapon. Her plan began to form, a dangerous, intricate piece of psychological warfare. She had to appear vulnerable, to give them a reason to believe they could finally take her and the farm without being picked off from a mile away. She began by showing herself. For the first time since Jacob's death, she rode into solitude. She was a changed woman. The softness was gone from her face, replaced by a lean, hard watchfulness. Her eyes, once gentle, were now distant and cold. She wore a simple, practical dress, but across the back of her saddle, plain for all to see, was the scabbard of the Winchester rifle. Her presence caused a stir. The townspeople stared, whispering behind their hands. Blackwood's men, loitering outside the saloon, watched her with a mixture of contempt and a new, grudging uncertainty. She ignored them all. She went to the general store, bought a sack of flour and some cartridges for the Winchester, her movements calm and deliberate. She was making a statement. I am still here. I am armed. And I am not afraid. As she was tying the flour sack to her saddle, Gage himself stepped out of the saloon. He stood on the porch, his arms crossed, his face a thunderous mask. Their eyes met across the dusty street. It was the first time they had seen each other since the day he'd murdered her husband. In his eyes, she saw hatred and frustration. She let him see nothing in hers but cold, empty defiance. She mounted her horse, gave him one last, level look, and rode slowly out of town. The act was a declaration of war, and it had the desired effect. Gage, goaded by her silent challenge and his own mounting paranoia, became obsessed. He was convinced that the widow, while a nuisance, couldn't be the ghost. He believed she had hired someone, that the real killer was holed up on her farm. The Harlow place was the nest, and he was determined to burn it out. Clara knew he would come, but she needed to control the time and place of the confrontation. She spent the next few days engaged in conspicuous activity. She repaired the fence along the main road. She worked in her garden, always keeping the Winchester close at hand. She was making herself a visible, tempting target. Then, she laid the final piece of the trap. The tinker, her one source of news, was due for his monthly visit. She knew that Blackwood's men often shook him down for information as he left the valley. This time, she would give him information to share. When the old man arrived at her farm, his wagon laden with pots and pans, she was unusually talkative. She spoke of her loneliness, of her fear. She mentioned, with a carefully crafted tremor in her voice, that her well pump was broken. She said she would have to spend the entire next day, from sunup to sundown, down in the well itself, trying to fix the mechanism at the bottom. She would be trapped, vulnerable, with no way to see anyone approaching the farm. The tinker, a kind man, was filled with concern. He offered to help, but she politely refused. As he left, his mind filled with worry for the poor widow, she watched him go, her face a mask of stone. She knew he was an honest man and wouldn't betray her intentionally. But she also knew that Gage's men would wring the information out of him, one way or another. The next morning, Clara did not go down the well. Instead, she climbed into the hayloft of her barn, to the sniper's nest she had prepared weeks ago. It had a commanding view of the house, the well, and the long, open field that an approaching rider would have to cross. She had 2 rifles with her, the Winchester for closer work, and the powerful Sharps for the distances. She had food, water, and a full day's supply of ammunition. She watched the sun rise. The farm was quiet, deceptively peaceful. The broken pump handle she had rigged was a clear signal of her vulnerability. The bait was laid. The trap was set. Now, all she had to do was wait for the wolf to step into it. The hours crawled by. The sun beat down on the barn's roof. She remained perfectly still, a patient predator. Around midday, she saw them. Not a large posse, but 3 riders, approaching cautiously. At the lead was Gage. He had taken the bait. He had left the bulk of his men behind, coming with only 2 others, confident that 3 of them were more than enough to handle a lone woman trapped at the bottom of a well. They stopped at the edge of the field, surveying the silent farm. Gage pointed towards the well, then towards the house. He was giving orders. They were going to separate, to approach from 2 directions. It was exactly what she had hoped he would do. Clara settled behind the Sharps. She took a deep, steadying breath. The final names on her ledger had come to be crossed off. The air in the hayloft was thick with the scent of dry hay and a tension so sharp it felt like a physical presence. Below, the farm lay silent, a sun-bleached stage set for a final, bloody act. Clara watched through a small gap between the wooden slats of the barn wall as Gage and his 2 men dismounted at the edge of the field. They were being cautious, but their caution was steeped in an arrogant confidence. They were hunters closing in on a trapped animal. Gage gestured, sending 1 man, a weary outlaw named Pete, to circle around towards the back of the house. The other, a hulking brute called Marcus, was sent to check the barn. Gage himself, his pistol drawn, began the slow, deliberate walk towards the well, a predator savoring the final moments before the kill. This was the critical moment. Clara had to choose her first target. Taking out Gage immediately was tempting, but it would alert the other 2, who would have the cover of the buildings to hide behind. Her plan relied on precision and shock. She needed to remove Gage's support first, to isolate him, to strip away his confidence and leave him alone and exposed. She decided Marcus, the one heading for her position in the barn, had to be the first to go. She shifted from the Sharps to the lighter, faster handling Winchester. She tracked him through her sights as he approached the large barn doors. He was moving with a cocky swagger, his shotgun held loosely in one hand. He clearly didn't expect to find anything but a milk cow and some chickens. He reached the doors and shoved one open. He took one step into the shadowy interior and paused, letting his eyes adjust. From her perch directly above him, Clara held her breath. She could have shot him then, but the sound would have been contained within the barn, possibly giving her an extra second. Instead, she waited. He took another step forward, directly into the open space below the loft. She didn't aim her rifle at him. Beside her, a heavy block and tackle, used for lifting hay bales, hung from a thick rope. With a single, silent motion, she drew the hunting knife from her belt and sawed at the frayed rope. Marcus heard the faint thump of the severed rope hitting the loft floor and looked up. His eyes widened in confusion, and then terror, as he saw the massive iron hook and wooden block plummeting towards him. He had no time to even cry out. The heavy block struck him on the head and shoulder with bone-shattering force, driving him to the ground in a heap. He was out of the fight, either dead or dying, without a single shot being fired. One down. Clara immediately turned her attention back to the scene outside. Gage had reached the wellhead. He peered down into the darkness, a cruel smile on his face. "Time's up, Mrs. Harlow," he called down, his voice echoing slightly. "Come on out, or we start dropping rocks on your head." The other man, Pete, had reached the back of the house and was trying to force the door. Clara now had two targets, separated and unaware of what had happened in the barn. She made her decision. She leveled the Winchester, its barrel resting on a dirt-filled sack, and aimed at Pete. He was using his shoulder to ram the back door, his side exposed to her. It was a difficult shot, partially obscured by a corner of the house, but it was one she had practiced in her mind 100 times. Stillness. Breathe. She squeezed the trigger. The Winchester's crack was sharp and loud in the quiet air. Pete screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and collapsed, clutching a bloody wound in his leg. She had aimed to wound, not to kill. A dead man is silent. A screaming man is a distraction. Gage spun around at the sound of the shot, his face a mask of shocked fury. He saw Pete on the ground, but he couldn't see the shooter. The shot had come from the barn. "Marcus," he roared. "What the hell is going on in there?" The only answer was silence. Gage was no fool. He realized instantly what had happened. This wasn't a trap. It was a carefully planned execution. The woman wasn't in the well. She was in the barn. He was standing in the open, completely exposed. With a curse, he dove for the cover of the stone wellhead, firing his pistol wildly at the barn as he moved. Bullets thudded into the wooden walls, sending splinters flying. Clara didn't even flinch. She had already switched to the sharps. Gage was pinned behind the well, a solid piece of cover. A direct shot was impossible. But Clara wasn't aiming for a direct shot. She was aiming for the large, wooden yoke and bucket that hung on a frame over the well, a few feet above Gage's head. She lined up the shot. It was a gamble. Hitting the moving yoke would be difficult, but if she could shatter it, the heavy, waterlogged bucket and the remains of the frame would fall directly on top of him. She fired. The roar of the sharps was the voice of judgment itself. The massive bullet struck the wooden frame with incredible force. The wood didn't just break, it exploded. The heavy bucket, the chain, and a shower of splintered timber rained down on Gage's position. He cried out, a sound of pain and surprise, as the debris crashed down on him. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the agonized moans of the wounded man at the back of the house. Then, Gage staggered to his feet. He was bleeding from a cut on his head, his arm hanging at an odd angle, but he was alive, and his face was contorted with a demonic rage. He had lost. He had been outthought, outfought, and humiliated by a woman he had dismissed as a piece of property. His mind snapped. All thoughts of the map, the land, the mission for Blackwood, were burned away by a pure, animalistic need to kill the woman who had done this to him. "You're dead, bitch," he screamed, his voice raw and unhinged. He began to charge directly at the barn, firing his pistol blindly as he ran. He was a force of pure, suicidal rage. In the loft, Clara calmly worked the action on the sharps, ejecting the spent cartridge. She chambered a new round. She had him. There was no cover for him now, nothing but 50 yards of open ground between him and her. She settled the crosshairs on his chest. The world slowed to a crawl. She saw his face, twisted in a mask of hate. She saw the dust kicking up around his pounding feet. She saw the man who had murdered her husband, who had laughed as her world ended. And she felt nothing. No rage, no fear, not even satisfaction. There was only the cold, quiet finality of the task. The last name on the ledger. She took a breath. She squeezed the trigger. The punctuation was delivered. The roar of the Sharp's rifle echoed across the valley, a sound of such profound finality that it seemed to hang in there long after it had faded. Gage's momentum carried him a few more steps before he collapsed, his charge ending in a crumpled heap in the middle of the field he had tried to steal. Silence descended once more upon the Harlow farm, a silence broken only by the wind and the whimpering of the outlaws she had left alive. Clara remained in the loft for a long time, the rifle still resting in her hands. The storm of violence had passed, leaving behind a strange, hollow calm. She had done it. The ledger was clear. She had avenged Jacob's death. But the emptiness she felt was vast and aching. Vengeance had not filled the hole in her life. It had only scoured it clean. Slowly, she made her way down from the loft. She stepped out of the barn into the bright and forgiving sunlight. The scene was a grim tableau of her own making. She walked past the body of Gage without a second glance. Her focus was on the wounded man Pete, who was trying to drag himself away, leaving a pathetic trail of blood in the dust. He looked up at her as she approached, his face a mask of terror. He expected the final bullet. He saw a woman whose face was as hard and unforgiving as the landscape around them. "Water," he croaked, his voice a dry rasp. Clara looked at him, at the man who had ridden with her husband's murderers, who had come to her home to do her harm. A part of her, the ghost she had become, felt nothing. But beneath that, something else stirred. The woman who healed, the woman who nurtured. She went to the pump, which had never been broken, and filled the dipper with cool, clean water. She brought it to him and held it to his lips as he drank greedily. "The horse," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Get on it and ride east. Don't ever come back to this valley. Tell your master, Silas Blackwood, what happened here today. Tell him the ghost of this valley is not for sale. And tell him I'm keeping the well." The man stared at her, his fear mixed with a dawning, incredulous awe. He nodded weakly. With Clara watching, he painfully dragged himself to his horse, hauled himself into the saddle, and rode away, a living message of defeat. The news he carried hit Solitude like a shockwave. It came not as a rumor, but as a direct, terrifying report delivered to Silas Blackwood himself. Gage was dead. Marcus and Pete were gone. The widow had done it. The story was at first unbelievable. A lone woman had taken down 3 of Blackwood's toughest men. But the evidence was undeniable. The fear that had been slowly eating away at Blackwood's gang turned into a full-blown rout. Men who had signed on for easy money and brutal fun had no stomach for facing an invisible, seemingly invincible sniper who was defending her own land. They began to desert in droves, melting away into the territory, leaving Blackwood with only a handful of his most loyal, and now most terrified gunmen. Blackwood's empire of fear had been built on a foundation of unassailable strength. Clara had shattered that foundation with a handful of well-placed bullets. She had shown everyone that he was not invincible. The change in the town of Solitude was not immediate, but it was profound. It began as a whisper, a shared look between two merchants, a nod from a rancher who had been paying protection money for years. The fear was still there, but it was now mixed with something else, a spark of defiance. Sheriff Calloway, a man long bent by the weight of his own compromises, heard the story and felt a lifetime of shame curdle into a final, desperate resolve. He walked out of his office, his shotgun in his hands, and tore down the notice from Blackwood's land office that had been posted on the town's message board. It was a small act, but it was a seismic one. It was the first time in years that the law in Solitude had shown its face. A delegation of ranchers, who had been meeting in secret for weeks, rode into town and confronted Blackwood's remaining men in the saloon. There was no gunfire. The outlaws, their confidence shattered, their leader dead, simply backed down. They were paid bullies, not soldiers willing to die for a losing cause. The power had shifted. The echo of Clara's rifle shots had become a rallying cry for a town that had forgotten how to speak for itself. They found their voice in her silence, their strength in her solitude. While Clara remained on her farm, the ghost on her ridge, her battle had started a quiet, unstoppable revolution in the valley below. In the weeks that followed the Battle of Harlow's Farm, as it came to be known, a fragile and certain peace settled over the valley. Silas Blackwood was a snake defanged. His gang had evaporated, leaving him a wealthy man with no muscle to enforce his will. He barricaded himself in his opulent ranch house, prisoner of the very fear he had once wielded as a weapon. He was a king with no subjects, his power exposed as the hollow thing it had always been. The people of Solitude, emboldened by Blackwood's fall from grace, began to reclaim their lives. Sheriff Calloway, with the backing of the town council and the local ranchers, formally deputized a half-dozen good men. They began to enforce the real law, not the twisted version that had served Blackwood's interests. The change was palpable. People walked the streets with their heads held a little higher. The sound of laughter, a long-absent stranger, began to return to the town. And it was all because of the woman on the ridge. Clara Harlow became a legend, a figure of mythic proportions. She never came to town. She remained on her farm, a solitary, enigmatic figure. People spoke of her in hushed, reverent tones. They called her the ghost of the valley, the widowmaker, Solitude's angel. They told stories, embellished with each retelling, of her impossible shots, of her supernatural calm. They left gifts for her at the edge of her property: a sack of flour, a basket of fresh vegetables, a newly forged blade for her plow. They were offerings, tributes to the guardian they did not know, but to whom they owed everything. Clara accepted the gifts, but she did not engage with the myth. She was not a ghost or an angel. She was a woman living in the quiet, echoing aftermath of a war she had never wanted to fight. The stillness she had once sought with Jacob was now her constant companion, but it was a different kind of stillness. It was heavy, weighted with the memory of what she had done. The faces of the men she had killed visited her in her dreams. Not as monsters, but as men, their expressions of shock and surprise a permanent brand on her memory. She worked the farm, her hands finding solace in the familiar rhythms of planting and harvesting. The land that had been soaked in her husband's blood now brought forth new life under her care. It was a strange, painful penance. The Sharp's rifle, the instrument of her vengeance, she cleaned and oiled meticulously before wrapping it in oilcloth and placing it back in its long wooden box. She hoped she would never have to use it again. One day, she received a visitor. Sheriff Calloway rode out to her farm, alone. He did not approach the house, but stopped at the fence line and waited. Clara came out onto the porch, her Winchester held loosely in her hand, a habit that was now second nature. "Mrs. Harlow," he said, removing his hat. He looked older, but his back was straighter than she had ever seen it. "I'm not here on official business. There are no warrants for you. As far as the law is concerned, Gage and his men were killed by persons unknown while resisting arrest." He paused. "I came to thank you. You gave this town back its soul." "I did what I had to do to protect my home, Sheriff," she replied, her voice quiet. "You did more than that," he said. "You reminded us that one person, standing for what's right, can be more powerful than a whole army of bullies. The town, we're forming a proper militia. We'd be honored if you'd consider helping us train some of our younger men. Your skill." Clara looked past him, towards the high ridge where she and Jacob had spent so many peaceful hours. "My skill, Sheriff, came at a high price. It's not something I wish to teach." The finality in her voice was absolute. He nodded, understanding. "Well," he said, placing his hat back on his head, "the offer stands. And the town's gratitude is yours, whether you want it or not." He turned his horse and rode away. Clara watched him go, a single, lonely figure against the vast landscape. He had offered her a way back, a place in the community she had saved. But she knew, with a deep, aching certainty, that she couldn't take it. The ghost she had become could not sit in a church pew or share idle gossip over a fence. The price of her victory, the price of the stillness she had won, was her solitude. The peace was not destined to last. Silas Blackwood, a man consumed by humiliation and a thirst for revenge, was not the type to simply fade away. He had lost his gang, but he had not lost his fortune. And in the lawless territories, money could buy a new army. He sent riders east, to the wretched, desperate towns on the fringes of civilization, with promises of gold. He hired a new kind of killer. Not the brutish thugs Gage had led, but a dozen hired gunslingers, mercenaries who killed for pay, led by a man known only as Leclerc. Leclerc was a Creole from New Orleans, a man of refined manners, elegant dress, and a complete absence of a soul. He was a professional, and he saw the ghost of the valley not as a phantom, but as a contract to be fulfilled. The first sign of their arrival was the smoke. Leclerc's men did not bother with the slow intimidation Blackwood had favored. They rode to the outlying farms, the ones whose owners had shown the most defiance, and they burned them to the ground. It was a swift, brutal message. The old power was back, and it was more ruthless than ever. The news reached Clara via a frantic, terrified rider from one of the burned-out homesteads. He told her of the new gunmen, of their cold, professional cruelty, and of their stated goal, to capture the Harlow farm and kill the woman who had started the rebellion. A deep weariness settled over Clara. She had fought her war. She had won. She had wanted only to be left alone. But the serpent, wounded and enraged, had returned to strike one last time. This time, however, it was not just her farm at stake. It was the entire valley. The fragile peace she had won for them was about to be shattered. The people of Solitude did not cower. The town that had found its courage was not about to surrender it. When the news of the attacks arrived, Sheriff Calloway rang the church bell, the same bell that had tolled for Jacob's funeral. But this time, it was not a sound of mourning, it was a call to arms. The newly formed militia, armed with everything from modern rifles to ancient farm shotguns, gathered in the street. They were farmers and merchants, not soldiers, but they were ready to fight for their homes. Their plan was to fortify the town. But Clara, hearing the distant bell from her ridge, knew that was a mistake. Leclerc was a professional. He wouldn't be drawn into a messy street fight where the townspeople had the advantage of cover and numbers. He would lay siege. He would cut them off, starve them out, and pick them off. She knew, with a grim certainty, that the final battle had to be fought here, on her land. Her farm was the symbol. Her farm, and the ridge above it, was the most defensible position in the valley. It was the high ground. To win, they had to hold it. She sent a message to the sheriff via the same young rider. Do not wait for them in the town. Bring your men to my ridge. We will make our stand here. It was a testament to the legend she had become that they listened. As the sun began to set, a small, determined army of about 30 men made their way from Solitude to Harlow's Ridge. They looked up at the quiet woman who met them there, at her plain dress and her steady, calm eyes, and they placed the fate of their valley in her hands. Clara was no longer just a sniper, she had become a general. She directed the placement of the men with a quiet, logical authority. She used her intimate knowledge of the terrain, pointing out natural rock formations for cover, establishing interlocking fields of fire. The men, many of whom were skilled hunters, recognized the simple, brutal genius of her plan. As twilight descended, they watched from the heights as Leclerc and his dozen hired guns rode into the valley. They were a stark contrast to Gage's unruly mob. They rode in a disciplined formation, their movements economical and precise. They bypassed the town of Solitude, just as Clara had predicted, and headed directly for the Harlow farm. They stopped at the edge of the field where Gage had fallen, the land now a designated killing ground. Leclerc surveyed the farm and the ridge above it through a small spyglass. He was not a fool. He saw the silent, waiting stillness and knew it was a trap. They are on the ridge, he said to his second-in-command, his voice calm, with just a hint of a French accent. The peasant army and their phantom queen. Disperse. We will climb. We will flank them in the darkness and butcher them in their sleep. The final battle for the Dust Devil Valley would not be a long-distance duel. It would be a close, desperate, and bloody fight for the high ground in the dead of night. The battle for Harlow's Ridge was fought in the suffocating darkness, a brutal, intimate affair of shadows and whispers, of sudden, close-range violence. Leclerc and his mercenaries were skilled night fighters, moving up the rocky slopes like wraiths, their goal to infiltrate the militia's lines and turn their high ground into a slaughterhouse. But Clara had anticipated this. She had not positioned her men on the very crest of the ridge, where they would be silhouetted against the stars. Instead, she had placed them on a series of lower terraces, hidden in the deep shadows of the rock formations. She had turned the entire ridge into a layered, defensive web. She herself took the highest position, not with the sharps, which was useless in this close, dark fight, but with the Winchester and a brace of pistols. She was not a commander directing a battle from the rear. She was the final line of defense, her eyes and ears straining to catch any sign of the enemy's advance. The first attack came on the far left flank. A dislodged pebble, a muffled curse that was the only warning. One of the ranchers on watch fired his shotgun into the darkness, the roar and the flash of the blast revealing the ghostly shapes of 3 of Leclerc's men for a fraction of a second. The fight was on. It was a chaotic, terrifying brawl. Gunshots flashed intermittently, illuminating hellish, split-second tableaus of men locked in desperate combat. The farmers and ranchers, fighting on land they knew, defending their homes and families, fought with a desperate, savage courage. They were outskilled, but they were not outmatched in heart. Clara moved along the top of the ridge like a true ghost, a phantom of vengeance and protection. Her role was not to hold a position, but to reinforce her line wherever it was weakest. She seemed to be everywhere at once, her calm voice calling out warnings, her Winchester barking its support. A mercenary, about to get the drop on a young farmer, would suddenly find his world exploding as a bullet from the darkness found him. She was the Overwatch, the guardian angel of the ridge, her shots precise, deadly, and always seeming to come from nowhere. Leclerc himself led the main assault, a silent, deadly push up a central ravine. He and 4 of his best men moved with a terrifying efficiency, dispatching 2 of the militia's sentries with knives before they could even raise an alarm. They were halfway to the crest, on the verge of breaking through the defensive line and rolling up the flank. They were stopped by Sheriff Cowboy. The old lawman, his back against a boulder, his shotgun held steady, was the only thing standing between Leclerc and victory. "That's far enough," he said, his voice the calm, steady voice of a man who had made his peace with whatever came next. The ravine erupted in gunfire. Calloway took a bullet in the shoulder but managed to get off both barrels of his shotgun, the blast echoing like thunder, cutting down 2 of Leclerc's men. He slumped to the ground, wounded but having bought the precious seconds the militia needed. Clara saw the flashes from the ravine and knew it was the decisive point of the battle. She left her high perch and scrambled down the rocks, moving with a speed and agility that belied her gentle past. She arrived to find Leclerc and his 2 remaining men about to overwhelm the wounded sheriff. She opened fire from above, her shots forcing the mercenaries to take cover. Leclerc, for the first time, saw his phantom quarry. Not a ghost, not a demon, but a woman, her face smeared with grime, her eyes burning with a cold fire in the flash of the gunfire. He was a professional, and in that moment, he felt a flicker of professional admiration. Then, he raised his pistol to kill her. His shot went wide as a heavy body slammed into him from the side. It was one of the ranchers, a big bear of a man, who tackled Leclerc, carrying them both to the ground in a desperate, grunting struggle. Clara did not hesitate. She dispatched 1 of the remaining mercenaries with a clean shot from her Winchester. The last one turned on her, his pistol raised. She dropped the rifle and drew her own pistol, firing from the hip. Her shot and his seemed to explode at the same instant. A hot, searing pain tore through her left arm, but her own bullet struck the man in the chest, sending him staggering back. The fight was over. The remaining mercenaries, their leader embroiled in a life-or-death struggle, and their numbers shattered, broke and fled into the darkness. The ridge was held. Clara, clutching her bleeding arm, stood over the 2 men wrestling on the ground. The rancher, wounded but powerful, finally gained the upper hand, his large hands closing round Leclerc's throat. Clara raised her pistol. She could end it. She could put a final, definitive stop to Silas Blackwood's war. "No," she said, her voice cutting through the ragged gasps of the 2 men. The rancher looked up, his face a mask of hate. "He's not worth the bullet," she said. "The law can have what's left of him." As the sun rose, it revealed a scene of victory. The militia had held the ridge. They had lost good men, and many were wounded, including Clara and the sheriff, but they had won. They had saved their valley. A group of them brought a bound and beaten Leclerc down from the ridge. The price of his professional services had been his own defeat. They never had to deal with Silas Blackwood. When the news of Leclerc's defeat reached him, when he realized that he had sent a professional army against a farmer's wife and lost, something inside him broke. He took the coward's way out. Sheriff Calloway and his men found him in his opulent office, a single, self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The serpent had finally consumed itself. The war was over. Clara Harlow did not become the mayor. She did not become the sheriff. When her arm healed, she went back to her farm. The town wanted to build her a new house, a grand one, but she refused. She, with the help of her neighbors, rebuilt her old one, plank by plank. She was no longer a ghost, but she was not the same woman she had been. The softness had not entirely returned, but the coldness in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, deep-seated strength. She was a woman who knew the language of the land, the language of the rifle, and, now, the language of her own resilient heart. She was still a solitary figure, but she was no longer alone. She was the guardian of the valley, a living symbol of their courage. The children of solitude would grow up with the story of the ghost of Harlow's Ridge, the gentle farmer's wife who had taught a valley of frightened men how to stand up, and who had proven that true justice, sometimes, is delivered through the eye of a needle, from a whisper on the wind.